Hey guys, welcome to today's video where we're going to look at the slave trade from about the 1500s to the 1800s and its impact on Africa, because that's our new unit, Unit 5. In particular, we're going to look at the Middle Passage and how slaves were acquired from the continent. All right, so I know when we typically think about slavery, we always jump to the American South because that's something that for you guys in the school system, it's kind of been hammered into you, really from an early age. But it's not just that. It's not slaves didn't just go to the United States or to North America and just go to the American South. Really, in fact, we have upwards of, depending on what numbers you believe or trust, in the ballpark of 10 to 15 million slaves entering the New World from Africa. Right? And that's not even including slaves that went to Europe rather than to the New World. So a lot of them were purchased from traders, African kingdoms on the Gold Coast, the west coast of Africa. Obviously, due to the proximity to the New World, I think that is, I wouldn't, because obviously there are areas, if we want to think about um, the west coast closest to uh, Europe is obviously even closer in proximity to, or in geography, to the New World, but rather than them just grabbing it from the eastern coast of Africa, and it has a really long history. So dating back to the mid 16th century or mid 1500s, where slaves were purchased by English trade or by European, sorry, not just English, European traders along their route, their attempted route to the other side of Africa, and eventually to India and China. Um, but even though the slave trade happened as early as the 16th century, the majority of slaves that came to North America was in this just about this half century, 60-year uh, period of time from 1720 till right after, or right during the uh, the Revolutionary War. Um, and in fact, when we look at the overall numbers, only about 6% of slaves, the total number of slaves that came to the New World, right, went to British North America. So we think about primarily the United States, or what would become the United States, and even then primarily in the South. Um, but it's relatively a small number, even though we in the U.S. typically have such a strong emphasis, and we don't necessarily focus on the other areas that they went to. And this happened because of what became known as this triangle trade. All right, so we have just the video. This image is on your note sheet, so you can see it there as well. But we look at all the different interactions, the economic interactions between these different groups. So we have slaves coming out of Africa, right, going to Europe, going to the Caribbean, and slaves kind of after they make this jump, they're making the jump to North America. And then once those goods are processed, then whether it's sugar, rum in the Caribbean, or cotton in the American South, and it's shipped to Europe to be manufactured, which then is, or to be processed, which is then shipped back to the United States or to Africa to trade for more slaves. So we see this um, balance of trade. I don't say balance, but this relationship of trade between these different areas. I know I say triangle, but it's really more of a square because it's all interconnected. Um, but when we really think it's Europe, Africa, and the New World, and it's a lot of significant trading going on for a number of years, where this is kind of making the institution of slavery around the world, not just in North America and the Caribbean, but really around the world, as a strong institution, as a institution that through the 1700s doesn't really, the early part of the 1700s is not seen as something that is going to disappear anytime soon. Um, but even though we see that when the numbers we gave before, 10 to 15 million slaves, doesn't necessarily mean that that passage was easy. Where we call this the Middle Passage, because they would go to the Caribbean, and then some would then be sold to North America. Some would stay in the Caribbean on the sugar islands to harvest the sugar crop. But this Middle Passage was very deadly. Had really a negative impact, not only in the physical, but really the psychological element of these slaves, because they were taken from their home. Most of the time, they didn't understand what was going on, because they were going to an unfamiliar place. They were being crammed into these tight, dark spaces with people that were speaking languages that they didn't understand. Right? Because when we think about Africa, Africa is very linguistically diverse. Yes, there might have been people that spoke a similar language or the same language or even from the same tribe, but they were being thrown into the cargo hold of a ship, um, and being forced to endure these really inhumane conditions, which we'll talk about and you'll see in the videos and then the primary sources that you'll look at later. Um, but it was not only just damaging physically and psychologically, but there was an incredible amount of death. 1 out of every 6, right? So nearly 20% um, of slaves ended up dying in the Middle Passage. Right? And we see this death rate is similar, maybe not as dramatic for the European crew, or sorry, for the European crew, but it was still significant. So this journey, as we call the Middle Passage, was not without its negative impact. Obviously, we're talking about overall negative. You're capturing human beings, buying and selling human beings. So that's incredibly negative, incredibly inhumane. But just purely the treatment and the suffering of their journey. So we see here, this is a depiction of what a tightly packed, because there were loose packers and tight packers, a tightly packed slave ship might look like on its journey from Africa to the New World. So we see that they're literally head to toe, side by side. All right. Some of them might even be rolled over to their on one side or the other. All right. They are crammed in every possible space. All right. Whether it was whether they were on shelves or whether they were just simply laying on a single layer of the floor, they were crammed in there to save as much money as possible. They're not worried about the spread of disease or illness. They're trying to get as many slaves over from Africa to the New World. This is a larger, if we see here, this is the flipped version. What we just saw is a flipped version of what you guys will see here, right? Or what you guys see on this larger image. So even if we kind of zoom, if we tried to zoom in here, you'd see the same thing, right? Tightly packed, toe to toe, head to head. In some cases, much like sardines, it's kind of jammed in there with really no regard for humanity, really. All right, so we see here this is a kind of a vertical version, a vertical image of the cargo hold of this area right here. It's kind of hard to see, but you just see how they're crammed in there. They're almost sitting on, not almost, they are sitting on top of each other. So again, just another example. You guys will watch this video, so it's it shows the initial scenes of capture of a slave, the transportation, and then obviously the Middle Passage, and how horrible those conditions were. Right, so watch this video and you'll answer the questions at the bottom of that first page. But one thing that doesn't necessarily get a lot of focus is that this trade was not just for Europeans, or it didn't just have a benefit for the Europeans, but it also benefited African kingdoms. Right? Yeah, yes, in the long run, we know that there was an incredible negative impact because Africa lost a large male population, and it had for generations, and really, some historians might argue even through today has not been able to recover from that loss, and the kind of the infighting and the strife that was caused by it is still having a significant impact. But we see that African kings, African rulers benefited from this trade. The product that they gained the most from was guns. Obviously, yes, they were given rum, sorry, rum and other tradable goods, but guns were were primarily what they sought, because their possession of guns allowed them to exercise a greater level of control over their own people, and then maybe even extend their reach, extend their power inland or against other tribes along the coast. And initially, they were these slaves, or the Africans that were taken as slaves were seized as prisoners of war, and then they were just simply traded off to these European traders, or they sold off to these European traders. But eventually, they realized, these African rulers, African kings realized how profitable the system could be, so they began going out into raiding neighboring tribes, neighboring areas, and capturing, kidnapping men, women, and children for this slave trade. So they were very opportunistic in some cases, to benefit themselves. And like I was saying before, some historians would argue that the negative impact of the slave trade still continues to ravage Africa today, because we see the disruption culturally, economically, put Africa at a disadvantage that kind of snowballed into disadvantages through the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and even now in the 21st century, where they are not able to keep up with other parts of the world because they are just so far behind. This conflict, this strife is just so ingrained in their daily interactions. But what we see with these raids into neighboring tribes, we see societies, whole cultures disrupted. And that has obviously, I talk about losing language, song, art, that has a huge impact. So we see that this on the negative side, but in a way, and I'm not saying it's positive, all right, in a way that this African diaspora, so we know what diaspora, we've come familiar with that word before when we looked at the Jewish diaspora, all right, after their war with the Roman Empire. Africa culturally had a diaspora. So we see African culture being really spread throughout the world, where the world had previously not had much of an impact or interaction with Africa, but now is almost on a daily basis in some way interacting with Africa. Again, much like the other video, you'll see this kind of explains and goes into the other aspects of the Atlantic slave trade. And we think Atlantic slave trade, that middle passage, that triangle trade that was going on. So watch this video and then answer the questions at the very end of the note packet. Talk to you guys later.